So before we begin glazing, first we need to rinse off and let it dry before we begin glazing it. And that is to remove any debris or dust or any kind of flotsam that might still be attached to your piece. Even if it's fresh out of the kiln, it's a good idea to just go ahead and give it a rinse. Just go ahead and run it under the faucet. Get all the sides. And from there, we're going to let it dry to mostly room temperature. So do not begin glazing while your piece is still wet like this. Wait till it turns back to that chalky color. If you're going to be away for a while and your piece is going to sit out again in your house or your studio, go ahead and wrap it in a clean plastic bag and it will be ready for you to glaze when you come back to it. Just make sure that it's free of dust and debris. And the reason we want to do that is because if we attempted to glaze over the top of the bisque and it had any kind of dust, that would cause the liquid glaze to not attach and bond to the bisque. Because what we need is a good seal on there, so when our pieces fire, there won't be anything between the glaze and the bisqueware, and those will bond together and create the ceramic surface. So while we're waiting for our bisque to dry, we'll put that aside for now. And let's look at some glazes. So I have some pieces here, some examples. We're going to talk a little bit about different kinds of glazes. There are low fire and high fire glazes. And in this class, for the beginning, we're going to be working with mostly with high fire. And high fire glazes, you get kind of a smaller range of colors. They're kind of earth tone, not as bright, but you do get kind of more of a sturdy surface that stands up really well to hot and cold temperatures. This is another high fire piece. I have a dull peacock blue there and a more buff beige interior on the glaze in the inside there. Okay. So lower temperature firings, you get more of a range of colors. You get your reds, your yellows, your oranges. There are some high fire glazes that will sustain temperatures up to higher temperatures for bright colors, but in the main, your bright colors are going to be in this lower temperature range here. So we've got red and yellow. Over here we've got a royal blue. Okay, so when we're talking about firing temperatures, we're talking about a system in ceramics that's called cone firing. And cone firing is based on these little objects that are made out of clay. They're called witness cones, and there's a whole range of them. And the middle point starts at 0, and everything above 0, from 1 up to 10, is your high fire range. Anything from 0 below, you start at 01, 02, 03, kind of like the integer system, but instead of a minus, you've got a 0 in front of the number. And everything from 01 down to even like 022, you get substantially cooler as you go away from the 0. So anything above 0 in the 1 to 10, that's your high fire range. Anything below 0 in the 01 to 022 range, that's your cooler temperatures. And the cooler temperatures are at the end there. So the 022, 018, 05, 01. It goes from cooler to higher as it goes towards the 0. And then it continues from the 0, from 1 to 10, going higher and higher temperature up to the 10. Okay. Another thing with the low fire colors, it's a little more what you see is what you get. So if you want to do graphic patterns or color block sections, lower temperatures can be good for that. For a high fire, it's a glaze that's going to be exposed to more heat and more action in the kiln, especially if it's a gas firing. There's going to be a carbon atmosphere in there called reduction firing, and that's going to cause unpredictable and interesting results on your pieces. The glazes may flash in different areas. It'll be a little more unpredictable. It won't be so much what you see is what you get. Okay, so let's talk about application. And the reason I've chosen some of these pieces is they're kind of a rogues gallery of my own good examples of what not to do. So we'll take a look at those. First, we'll look at my sample here. And you can see I've got 3 different sections here. Okay. So when we're talking about applying glaze, we're talking about applying it in coats. And this represents 3 thicknesses of application of glaze. So down here at the bottom, I've got a single coat application of glaze. You can see it's very thin. You can see it's very translucent. Parts of the ceramic piece kind of show through the texture there, a couple lines. If you want to do it that way, that's fine. That can be a technique. You can see on a thin application of glaze here, you can actually see the details of the stamp that I applied to the clay when it was wet. A nice thin application or clear glaze will allow those details to show, because some of the excess glaze will sit in the lines that you put in your texture there, and that can pop out your design a little bit. For more of a solid background color block application though, you want to apply more glaze. So here we're looking at 2 coats being applied. So you get more of the pigment is applied to the surface of the glaze. You're getting more coverage, but you can still see a little bit through there. Some of the texture of the bisque shows through a little bit where I didn't smooth it down, but you're starting to get a nice coverage there. Okay, so the ideal coverage is about 3 coats. So you can see it's nice and opaque there. It covers most of the texture underneath of it. It's got a good seal on there. It's got a good amount of pigment. It's nice and developed. The color looks really good. It doesn't have that kind of dull denim. And these are all the same glaze, so you can see how different the application can make the glaze look. So that can be a real difference between kind of not successful and successful when it comes to finishing off your pieces. So you can see on this one, if it does get a little thick, it starts to pool a little bit. You can see that in profile. So what happens is that the glaze, when it's exposed to heat in the kiln, it actually turns liquid. So when we apply this to our pieces, it's going to look really chalky, just kind of like a household cleanser when it goes on. And when it's fired, that's what's going to develop the color and the glassy substance in the glaze. So just if you've ever seen glass blowing, it's the same thing. There's powdered glass inside of these glazes or compounds that will fuse together and create a glassy surface. And so when that is exposed to the heat, that will cause it to become liquid, and it can crawl down a little bit because of the force of gravity. So a little crawl is okay there. It just pooled a little bit there, but for the most part it stayed in place. But if you have an over thick application, so we've talked about under applying and getting a thin application, if you get too much glaze on there, you can get this problem. Okay, so this is where I applied very heavy, very thick coating of glaze to the point where it ran down like a huge teardrop, and then where it was sitting on the kiln shelf in the kiln, it just pooled there and created this big error right here. Okay, a big drop that had to be hammered off of the kiln shelf. So you don't want to do that. Luckily, I kept enough room down at the bottom of the piece here that where the glaze ran down, it just ran down, and there was enough of the bottom of the piece there to allow that glaze to run down and be okay. But I got too much glaze on the handle there, and it all sort of ran together with the glaze that's on the side there, and there was not enough clay under here to compensate for all the motion of that glaze there. So it's really important that we not glaze the bottom, because you can see right on the bottom there, that's where the glaze attached itself to the kiln shelf. So that's why we want to keep the bottom clean. But it's also important that we not glaze right to the edge of our pieces there. So if we did that and our glaze ran, there would be no place for that glaze to compensate. It would run down just like this and all be caught right on the bottom of your piece there. It can run under your piece. But the worst is when it sticks to the kiln shelf and fuses to the kiln shelf, because often that means you have to break your piece off the kiln shelf, and that can damage the kiln shelf, and kiln shelves are very expensive. They are covered with this white coating that can help facilitate your piece breaking off. But generally when this happens, it's very difficult to take off problems like this off of your glazed pieces. So it's just better to be very mindful of when you're glazing and be successful. Leave enough room on the bottom. Don't glaze the bottom of your pieces, and make sure your application isn't very thick, because it will take a lot longer to remove pieces like this off of your glazed pieces, to the point where it's just easier and faster to make a new piece to begin with. Some other things that can happen with the misapplication of glaze. So say you wanted to have a really developed color on the inside of a piece, and you say, aha, it's not going to run onto the kiln shelf, so I can put it in as thickly as I want to. Unfortunately for you, that is not true. And unfortunately for me, that is what happened with this piece. This is a nice red. I thought, oh, I can put a nice thick coat on there. But you can see in the light here, it pooled in the bottom of the piece. So the same thing, the glaze ran down the sides. It was caught, of course, in the bottom of the piece here, but then it created this kind of pancake of glaze here that got so thick that it was difficult for the chemicals that are in the clay that get released when you're firing the piece to actually penetrate through the layer of glaze that was on there. So I've got this kind of volcanic looking surface at the bottom there, where you can see the glaze was very thick, and those bubbles just got through the surface of the glaze, but it was just not enough to smooth out the surface and finish that off there. Okay, so another thing that could happen is if you apply too thickly and you also don't allow your coats of glaze to dry in between application, what can happen is that the brush will lift off pieces of the coat of glaze that you've got underneath. So say you put on your first coat, it's just barely dry, you rush to put on your second coat, that can lift away the glaze that's underneath here, and you can see I've got these little bald patches that are happening over the surface of this. Okay, so it got really bad down here. You can see where it's super thin, it's super thick here. This is a good example of a bad application of glaze. So when you are glazing something with a brush, you want to make sure you do 3 even coats, and you want to let each coat dry in between before applying the second coat. Let that dry, then apply the third coat. Okay? The first coat will dry very quickly because the piece will be dry. Our bisque piece will be dry in a moment, and it's going to grab onto the glaze and just kind of suck that in with the capillary effect. But once you start applying glaze on there, it's going to have more water because of the glaze is suspended in water. So the more water the piece takes on, the more saturated it's going to be with water. So that's why we're letting our piece dry after our rinse before we glaze it again, because if we applied glaze on here, watery glaze, the piece would repel the extra water, and that would start to make your glaze not dry, and it would get really patchy, and it wouldn't take the application of the glaze very well. Okay, so let's talk about our glazes. Now, glaze comes in all different kinds of forms of application. There's brushing glaze, there's dipping glaze, pouring glaze. For this semester, we're adapting some of our studio glazes to brushing, and some of these glazes might need a little tuning before we use them. So it's really good we've got them in these clear containers, because we can see what our first step is going to be. And you can see 2 sections here. There's this dark section under here where the bulk of the glaze is, and then we can see the water just sitting on the surface here. So before we even use these. We want to make sure that all the material is suspended completely and evenly in the water, so we're going to stir those from the bottom. So make sure you've got a large brush or a stir stick that you can stir with, and you want to get a container of clean water. So make sure you've got those going. Okay, I'm going to put that aside for a moment. And then let's look at this glaze, which has very little water sitting on the top. And this has a material in it, a glaze chemical called Gersley borate that can set like pudding. So some glazes will actually need a little water added to them. And if you have this green, this titania green, you'll need to actually add a little bit of water to it. And the suspension appearance of a good glaze that you're going to glaze on, it should have the appearance of, should be a little thicker than milk, probably a little thinner than the kind of cream you put in your coffee. So we're just going to add a little bit of water to this at a time. So I'm doing this first because I've still got nice clean water here. I'm going to add about a ½ inch of water on the top there. I'm going to take my brush and stir from the bottom. So make sure you get all the materials in your glaze in suspension. You don't leave anything sitting on the bottom because glazes are specially formulated with proportions of different chemicals, and if one proportion is not in the suspension completely and evenly, it can affect the chemistry of your glaze. Okay, so looks like a good suspension. I'm working on getting the lumps out of there. Okay, if your glaze is too thin, it will look really watery on your brush. You'll be able to see all the bristles of your brush, and it'll be really drippy when you lift the brush out of the glaze. So this looks pretty good right now. It's not pouring off of the brush. It's got a nice coating, kind of viscous. Okay. See the coating on the brush there? It's leaving a nice coating on the brush. So if I were to apply that onto a bisque piece, I know that's how much would probably stay on the bisque piece. Okay, so I'm going to rinse that brush. It's usually good to have a different brush for each color that you use, just so you don't contaminate your glazes and cross-contaminate the colorants. I'm going to go ahead and wash that off. Little traces of colorant are usually fine, but if you've got really filthy water or a brush that's encrusted with another kind of glaze, you can really start to contaminate your glazes. So try not to do that. Okay. The other thing we haven't really talked about yet is brushes. And I have got a variety of brushes, probably way too many brushes that I don't need. So brushes come in all shapes and sizes, from the very largest, these kind of Japanese calligraphy brushes that you can use to apply glaze in large sections. We've got these kind of flat and round painting brushes. These are good for doing background color, kind of medium sections on your pieces. You want a variety of smaller brushes, so when you get into little designs and details, you're not attempting to, I see this a lot of times, people have some line work and they're like, trying to apply glaze and keep it nice and crisp in little spaces like that. It's just easier if you have a variety of little brushes that you can keep the glaze in this, the areas that you want it. Okay, so if you go to Michael's, and they usually have like a 5 or 7 pack of brushes that go from like medium large to small, that can be good. If you've got a little money to invest, you can get some liner brushes from Amazon or Flax Art, California Art Supply in San Mateo. They've got a lot of good brushes. Okay, so you can treat yourself to a few of those. But you can also just kind of find these. This is like a set from a kindergarten set of brushes too. So I've got everything going on here. Brushes, as they age, will kind of develop their own characteristics, and sometimes that'll be something you like. Like I've got this calligraphy brush here that's developed this kind of tilt to it. Some people might say that's bad and throw it away, but other times they kind of develop an interesting marking of their own that you end up liking, so you hang on to the brush for long past its regular lifespan. Okay, so we've mixed up our green. We always want to make sure that we mix up our glazes before we use them, so they'll separate. So let's do our white glaze next. Okay. So even if they sit for an hour and you come back, you want to make sure that you mix them up from the bottom. Make sure that water's all mixed in there. If they seem like they're really thin, you can wait for them to settle and then pour off some of the clean water from the top. It's always easy to add more water in if you need to, but just wait for that glaze to settle for maybe a day. It'll have that half an inch or inch of clear water on the top, and you just carefully pour that off. Don't pour the glaze out, just pour some of the water out, stir it up, and then see what it looks like there. So this one's got a pretty good coating on there. And we can do our same. Okay. So this is good to talk about. Now the two glazes we've looked at, the white and the green, actually look white when it's liquid and green when it's liquid. That won't always be the case with glaze, and in this case with this glaze, it is not a red or a brown, it is actually a black glaze. And that means the chemicals in it are going to fuse together and create a darker glaze out of the chemicals that are in there. Okay. Some glazes are matte and some glazes are shiny. Some glazes are opaque. Some glazes are translucent. Some of them, if you combine them in different ways, will create a third color that can be very interesting. Glaze is a lifelong learning process. Some people like the uncontrolled process of high fire. Some people like the more controlled process of lower fire, color block glazing. There's all sorts of things you can use. Okay, what we're doing is just like the littlest taste of the range of things you can do with glaze. And if you aren't sure what a glaze is going to do in combination, or what it looks like, or what it's going to look like on your piece, it's always good to have little scrap pieces of your clay. You can fire them in the bisque, and then have pieces that you just use to test glazes on, and then you will have little sample chips so you know what it's going to look like for the most part. Sometimes it's a little different, but you'll get a sense of the range of activity on the glaze before you apply it to a piece that you really like. But we're going to be glazing these little square boxes first, so they've got several sides on there, so that might be a good opportunity for you to test what glazes do. And our piece is just about to be dry enough for me to glaze on here, so I'm going to go ahead and get some more clean water, and then I'll be back.